really wondering if anybody happens to be in my medieval cultures class. 3, 4, 5. Well, this is me. It's nice to meet you. I correspond by email. So first I'll introduce myself, and then I'll talk a little bit about my the research that I've been doing for the last 5 years or so. And Dr. Harrison said to talk about different types of research. So when I talk about that, there's actually kind of 3 types of research that go into making this kind of book that I'm going to show you. And as I talk about that, I'd also like to talk about the kind of research that goes into writing a thesis or a dissertation as well. So for my background, first I went to Cornell University, where I did a double major in, I'll get this, Russian and Soviet studies and Russian language and literature. And then I moved to the Czech Republic, well actually it was Czechoslovakia. I lived there for 7 years, and I studied the history of art and architecture, particularly Central European and Eastern European art and architecture. And I put some literature in there too. And then I went to Finland for a couple of years, and I did an MA in Russian literature. And then when I moved back to the States, I went to Harvard for a year, where I studied Slavic studies. And so I studied Russian, Ukrainian, and Czech literature. And then I went to Columbia, and because I had several MAs already, I was able to do a double PhD in Czech language and literature and Russian language and literature. And that's why I have translations in Czech, several in Czech and several in Russian, from Russian, I mean. So then I got a job. Well, actually, then I worked at Columbia for a little bit, where I taught just general world culture and world literature. And then finally I came here, and about, I think it was 2013 or 14, I got in touch with, I should say, the CEO of Broadview Press, which is a very important academic publisher in Canada. I got in touch with me, and they said that they wanted to do a Russian series. He had actually read my first translation. I should show you that. I'll pass these around too. I did this. I had a stipend when I finished graduate school, and I used it to translate these works from the late 19th century and mostly early 20th century, which are kind of decadent, symbolist, modernist works. And so all of them, except maybe one, had never been translated before. And I also did an introduction. And in this case, I had a co-translator, and so we worked together. That's when I realized that it was much easier just to be a translator. So he liked my translations and of these. I'll pass that around so you can take a look. And it's available on Amazon. It's also available as an ebook if you're interested in it. It's my most popular. And then they asked me to if I wanted to translate this one. Notes from the Underground by Dostoevsky. It's Dostoevsky's first really famous novel or novella, because it's short. It's one of his shortest. And they had me submit a translation of a passage, and then they had other people submit translations, and then they chose mine. And so I got to work for Broadview, which actually was really wonderful for me because I had heard of Broadview before, and I used their textbooks. I love their textbooks. I'll tell you why. They're really wonderful. I had used them before, and I was like, Broadview's my favorite publisher, and I never ever thought that I would work for them. But they're kind of, if you've ever done an English class, have you heard of Norton? No, Norton anthologies. They're kind of the equivalent of Norton in Canada. So they have, here I'll show you the structure. They have the contents at the beginning. They have, by the way, also nice cover pages. This picture was actually taken by a friend of mine who lives in Russia, and it's a picture of the general department store on the Red Square, looking up at the ceiling of this modern building. It looks like the Crystal Palace in London, that used to exist near London, which represented the essence of modernity that Dostoevsky hated and that he attacks in this book. So we used it as a cover. And then there's an introduction. I'll talk about how I wrote the introduction. Then after that, of course, there's the translation. And then this is one thing that I really like about Broadview. At the end, at much at the end, they have literary contexts. And then they have the translations they also translated of works that were important at the time that Dostoevsky was responding to. And so you could do a paper, like say you wanted to present a paper at a conference. You could take one of these. Got my glasses. Just gonna help me see. So this one's by Fourier, who was the French utopian socialist, and he influenced Dostoevsky. Well, actually, Dostoevsky hated him, and he hated a lot of people. And so Dostoevsky attacked him in this book. So you could take this excerpt from Fourier, and you could write a paper about it and say, Dostoevsky is attacking what Fourier says in this passage, and then you could give evidence from the passage, and then you could show how Dostoevsky is attacking it, and it would make a great paper. But this is different because Broadview wanted me to put in the context without any explanation. I mean, it just says what it is at the top. So it's a very little explanation, except that Dostoevsky hated him, that he's attacking him. So that in class, if they read it and they want to spend a longer time on it, maybe if it's an upper level class or if you're grad class, the professor might say to you, why don't you write a paper on how the novella relates to one of the excerpts at the back, for example. And then after that, I have some translations of poetry by a certain Nekrasov. He was a realist poet, very sentimental realist poet in Dostoevsky's time. I guess how Dostoevsky felt about him. Right, he hated him. But basically, he hated everybody in here. So anyway, and it's the same thing where you could write a paper about Nekrasov and Dostoevsky. They actually had a relationship. They knew each other. So you could write about they liked each other at first, and then they broke off, and it was largely because of Nekrasov's views and his terrible poetry. And then you could write how Notes in the Underground attacks Nekrasov's poetry, or you can just put the poetry at the end, and then you have an assignment to give your students. You figure out how it fits in there. So that's how they do it. And then at the very end, we have photographs. We have lots of pictures of Dostoevsky here and the Crystal Palace. I'll pass that one around too. I guess when they all go around, they can go back in the bag here. So here's another Notes from the Underground. I use this in a class, so it has some markings in it. Then the next one I did was Tolstoy. It's one of his most famous short stories, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, and then a number of other stories about death. And this is actually Victor Hugo, a French writer on his deathbed. It's a photograph. So I'll pass that one around. And it has the same form as the Dostoevsky. Then I did another one called We by Zamyatin, which is really modernist and has a great modernist picture. But just as I was leaving today, I was looking for it, and I remembered that I lent it to somebody. If you want to see the picture, you search We and Broadview. And if you want to put Lodge in there, just to be sure, it should come up on your phone or your computer or whatever. And then this one, I just have these two Czech ones. So I worked on the same period in Czech literature, the 1890s. So it's a bit more specific, basically the 1890s. It's decadent, known as decadent literature. And the most famous, their leader was Jiří Karásek, Zilowitz, and his novel, or novella, I should say, had never been translated into English before. So there's a press in Prague that specializes in works that are really famous in Eastern Europe, especially in the Czech Republic, that are not known outside of that area, and they translate them into English. And so they're also a very special publisher. And I did for them copy sold, and they have images, these weird images, decadent images from the same period. Let's see if I can find one here. Here's one that looks like a guy standing over a corpse with a sword or something. Anyway, gonna pass that one down. And finally, Karásek and the other decadents, they had a journal. They wrote poetry. Decadent poetry was like the new movement it came from Europe. And I translated their poetry, and it was published by the Charles University, which is the main university in Prague. And so this is just their poetry. It has an introduction. It doesn't have contextual materials or anything. And then, finally, this is just my first one. As this one goes to way back when, you don't even have to look at the date. This is when I did my master's in Poland, so I was working on an avant-garde Russian poet named Klemiko. His great niece, I think did this little, she's a painter, she's an artist, so she did this little cover design. And we made my mentor, my advisor, helped me to have the university in Finland publish my master's. So might as well pass that one along too. Okay, so I'll pause for questions.
How long did it take you to translate one of your books?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. Well, the problem is that I'm teaching. So it takes about like one like that one, they're about the same size. It takes about 2 years. Each one takes about 2 years. And I usually do Eureka with a student during the academic year. And what that student does usually is learn about the author. So I get the background partly for the introduction, but mostly for the contextual materials. Because I start out, I have no idea what contextual materials I'm going to use. So we have to find out what is Dostoevsky reacting to. Well, what would it be good to put in the end as contextual materials? And so my Eureka student looks into that, comes up with some ideas, and we discuss how it will be arranged. So that's during the year. And then if the materials aren't translated, then sometimes the student either can't even find out about them, or maybe they can, or they can't read them, and then I have to translate them if they're good enough. And then I do the translation over the summer. I usually teach one semester or one section, and the other section, I just like translate the whole thing. So, like actually the translation itself, of a book like that, or like the other one you have, that was one summer session. And then the background materials go pretty quickly too. Yeah, right. The translation is easier for me than the other stuff. Yeah, so about 2 years from the contract. So on my next one, is coming out. They always say it's going to be in January. Like the last one, they said it was going to be in January 2019. It came out in December. So this time they said it's going to come out. Oh, sorry, that's not my next one. That was my last one. Yeah, that was the last one. The next one is by Andrea. You can look for it. Andrea. It has 2 stories. The Red Lap, which is a novella, and The Abyss, which is a very controversial but famous short story. And they said it would be out by January 2021. All of the materials are in, but I think it'll be out by December. So soon, then we can celebrate. And then I have another Czech project coming up after that. So, other questions? Okay, that kind of actually that was one thing I was going to talk about is how I do the research for the different sections. Well, first let me talk about the introduction. So I have a PhD, say, in Russian literature. I've taken an undergraduate course on Dostoevsky and 3 graduate courses on Dostoevsky. Do you think that I could sit down and write an introduction to one of his books? No. Why? Well, I mean, I'd have a general knowledge, I'd like have some idea of his views and stuff, but what would I need? What would I have to research in order to write an introduction? How about the book itself? Well, I have general knowledge of the book, but maybe I haven't read articles about it by scholars. And scholars usually do exactly what I was saying before, something like Dostoevsky hated the utopian socialists, and then they write an article about that, and then say, they don't include the utopian socialists in there, so I read some utopian socialists, and then I say, well, that would fit in there. That would be something to include in the introduction, so I read about the work itself. Another thing is specifics. So I could tell you like basically about Dostoevsky's life, but I wouldn't remember the date of publication of all of his important books and all of these specifics, so I'd have to look everything up. And there are some important events in his lifetime, and there are certain events, especially his father. His father, the original story was that his father was murdered when Dostoevsky was like 17 by his serfs. Where the serfs were like the peasants, or almost they were like kind of like slaves. And it was believed that the servants or the serfs had killed him because he was such a mean and angry man, and he punished them so severely. And it was believed that after the death of his father, Dostoevsky came to sympathize more with the peasants, to think that somebody beat them so harshly that they killed him, and then he became a revolutionary. But now it turns out there's been more research that the peasants probably did not kill him. They probably got into a fight and then he had a heart attack. So another thing is you have to know these different versions, especially these famous stories. So you have to read the latest information, the latest biography, the latest articles, the most up to date where everything's been corrected. They might even say in the autobiography so-and-so in his or sorry, biography, so we say, in his famous biography about Dostoevsky, so-and-so says that the serfs murdered Dostoevsky's father, but research has shown since then that that is not true. That's something I should know if I'm writing an introduction. Right? That really influenced his life, and I do find a lot of things where things that they thought happened actually didn't, and we have to change things. So I had to get the newest biography is actually 3 volumes, and each volume is like 400 pages. I didn't have to read the whole thing, but most of it, enough to translate that work, which is from the 60s. I didn't have to go much past 60s. So, and then, oh, I was going to show you, is the computer on?
It is, yeah, you can
Okay.
switch to, I don't have the projector on.
Oh, okay. I was going to show you my the notes that I take when I'm doing research for the for both the introduction and also the contextual materials. Should I show them?
Yeah, that's fine. You help.
This one. Let's see. I wouldn't close this though, right? Just go here. Okay, I see. Can they still see me? Hello? I just, maybe you should do it
Where is your the stuff? Is it
in my email.
Okay, so I think we just want to just hold on just a minute.
And then this is your email.
No, sorry.
Yeah, just because a lot of people will teach you how to do an annotated bibliography. Have you done an annotated bibliography? Some of you or all of you? All of you. All of you. Okay, so you know what that is. I don't do that. Not anymore. I used to for an assignment. Okay. Oh. Can't do it. I should have gotten my glasses out. Sorry. I'm the absent-minded professor. Okay, I keep having to change my password too, because I can't remember it. Not telling me, but again, then it's wrong. How can it be wrong again? I'll try one more time. It does this to me at home too. That's what I mean. I don't really have to show it. It's just impressive how long it is. Oh, I have 2 L's in there? That's what it is. Okay, I'll do it like this. Okay, so when I'm doing research, and this is before I start doing the contextual materials, this is partly for the contextual materials and partly for the introduction. See what it looks like. So first of all, I write down every book and article that I read, even if it doesn't help me whatsoever. What do you think?
So you don't read it again.
Exactly. Especially if it's not very memorable. So the first one obviously wasn't helpful. Got the date wrong too, but I won't reread that one. The second one. So I have this one by Allen, and it looks like it helped a little bit. And so I noted that he was indebted to Victor Hugo. That's the guy who's on the cover. Of the Tolstoy, I think, before. This certain story by Hugo, and so that would be something I should go read that story and see if it has any relationship to the book that I'm translating. So I would mark that. Also, I look for interpretations, because in the introduction, the first part is about the author. The second part, the author and his works, and the second part is about the book itself. And in an introduction, generally, you don't want to come up with a new original thesis. You want to give an idea of how different people have interpreted it in the past. And so that's one reason I do all this reading, and see how different people have looked at it and what are the main ways it has been read. And then again, the professor who assigns it to his students, I said if that's our audience, by the way, I should have said, the professor who assigns it to his students, then the professor can say, well, you come up with your own interpretation, which is more like what you would do with a thesis or a dissertation. You come up with your own original interpretation that has not been written about before. But in a usual introduction, and there are some exceptions, you wouldn't want to have your own original thesis. So I start collecting interpretations of the story. And then obviously there are a bunch that weren't helpful. And here I am on page 1. Can you see how many pages there are? How many? 273. So Bakhtin is a really famous writer. He's a theorist, and he wrote a lot about Dostoevsky. And so it would be really important for me to take into account his interpretation of Dostoevsky, because, anybody who studies Dostoevsky would know. As a graduate student or a specialist, would know Bakhtin's interpretation of Dostoevsky. And I use highlighting also. So I know, for example, that Dostoevsky was really good friends with this guy called Kirsten, who was a revolutionary. And I thought at first that I might include something by Kirsten that would relate, because they had a lot of ideas actually in common this time. And so I just highlight some things that sounded a little bit like what Dostoevsky himself thought, and then I could look into that later. And then I highlighted Rousseau. Dostoevsky, actually, another one he liked was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And he has this whole part in Notes from the Underground about the superior, the so-called man of nature, and the main character, who was usually called the Underground Man because he doesn't have no name. He's never given a name in the book. And he likes this man of nature because he hasn't been destroyed by society. That comes right out of the philosopher, the 18th century philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So one thing I might want to include is an excerpt from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which I decided not to, but I could. So I'm just getting ideas. And the different colors mean different things. Oh, this is actually all this stuff about Rousseau, where I'm trying to figure out what exactly in Rousseau could be applicable to Notes from the Underground. So you can see I've written pages and pages. But look, something like this is important. No edition of collected or selected works of Rousseau appeared in Russian translation between 1762 and 1825. I mean, or maybe that isn't so important, but Dostoevsky was a young man. Well, he was a little bit too young. But if there were no translations of something later, then he could not have read it because Dostoevsky did not read English. He didn't read French. He knew a little. He thought he knew German, but he didn't really. So everything would have to have been translated into Russian for it to have influenced him. Here, Chernyshevsky's "What Is to Be Done" is also this utopian solution to, well, what do we need to do to reform Russian society? And it's also utopian socialism. It's all about how everybody's going to be nice to each other, and everybody's going to work together and be happy, and they'll be given their own little place to live, and it'll be like this little paradise. He wrote a whole novel on this. He went to prison for it, and actually Dostoevsky started Notes from the Underground, meaning to write a review of the novel by Chernyshevsky about the wonderful world that was coming in the future. And instead of doing that, he decided to write Notes from the Underground, where the main character himself says all these things that are counter to the views of Chernyshevsky. So that would be something that's definite. That's translated. I translated a chapter from the novel. I gave my student assistant, my core student assistant, had to read this 300-page bad Russian novel and see if there was anything that like what would be best to include. He had read Notes from the Underground, and then he read Chernyshevsky's novel, and then he suggested some things like what would be best for us to include. And you have it there. So we included a few passages from Chernyshevsky. So, and then and so I have this article also, which says, how they compare, which helps us figure out what to use. Belknap is really, really famous. He's from Colombia. The genre of the confession, Notes from the Underground, is mostly a confession. Usually some of these works are in Russian. Rousseau is the origin of the Western realization of the European crisis of civilization, and that falls right in line with what Dostoevsky says. And I highlighted an awful lot about Rousseau, even though in the end, mostly the reason I didn't include Rousseau, because there was so much of it that you could have included like the whole book, or more than one of his books. So his book, his Discourse on Equality or something like that. So you might as well just mention it in the introduction. So that's just to give you an idea of how much work just goes into before you sit down and write an introduction. So there's Baudelaire. It's also, and Hegel reaction. Hegel is also relevant. There are all these people, and then I have to decide about which ones are the most relevant. And there I have some Russian from his Dostoevsky's, what he wrote to his brother. Well, we included some excerpts from Dostoevsky's diaries and from Dostoevsky's letters, and he writes, about himself and about his time. So that's, we have a lot of that included in both the Tolstoy, well, actually in all of them. The materials that are written by the author himself are always really helpful. So here, I'll just give you an idea how it goes on and on and on. As we said, here I am on page 141 of 273. So even though I took 3 graduate level courses in Dostoevsky, I couldn't just sit down and write an introduction to notes from underground, as you can see, nor could I sit down and pick out the background materials. But I had the basis to know where to look. So now, basically, I read everything that, actually, there's a lot on Dostoevsky. He's really famous. If you haven't heard of him, now you've heard of him. He's really, really famous. So there must be thousands of books and articles written on him. So of course, I can't read all of them. So I tried to at least read those that were pertinent to that time of his life, or to Notes from the Underground, which I was translating, especially interpretations of Notes from the Underground. So that's the, I researched the introduction and the context. So I'll pause for questions.
What got you interested in Eastern European language?
Ah, that's a good question. Well, I was living in France. I might as well tell you how old I was. I was doing my senior year abroad in France, and it was 1986. And Gorbachev came to power. He was a reformer. He was going to reform everything. And everyone in France was talking about it. I took economics in high school in France for the first time. I was really interested in this whole thing. And then Chernobyl, the nuclear explosion, and everyone in France was afraid that they were going to be poisoned by nuclear radiation in France, because the winds were blowing in that direction. And so those two things put together, everyone was talking about Russia, and so I was interested in it. And then I was living with a French family, and the father of the family got me a textbook to teach myself Russian, which is called Le Russe sans peine, Russian without pain. And and I started working on it. And I got far enough to get into, I guess we got into the second semester when I got to college. And then, so that's how I got into that. But actually, when I started, I told you I had two majors. My first major was Russian and Soviet studies, and you have to have a concentration, and my concentration was politics. And that was because Gorbachev got me interested in the reforming process, and socialism was so different to me. No one had ever talked about it to me before in the United States, and I didn't know anything except that it was a bad word. That you weren't supposed to talk about it. And I got really interested in this different system and how it compared to ours and why they wanted it rather than capitalism. And so I did that for a while, and I decided I was really bad at that, and I was much better at analyzing literature. And I thought I would make a terrible politician if I ever wanted to do that. So then I changed my concentration from political science to language and literature. But then my advisor said, actually you have enough courses in the concentration in language and literature that you can do a second major in Russian language and literature. So I did that as well. That's how I first got into it. And then when I finished, so I finished in 91, which is, I also studied abroad, studied in the Soviet Union in 89. All of these are significant dates. I don't know if you recognize them as significant dates, but 89 was the fall of the Berlin Wall. Everything was collapsing, and it was obvious that Gorbachev's reforms were not working. And then 89 was also the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, and they broke away from the Soviet bloc. And then in 91, but that was after I went there, the Soviet Union finally collapsed. But I went there in early 91 after I graduated. So I went there in, I think, June, and it collapsed in, I think, July or August, just a couple months later. So that's how I got into the Czech part, and I really wanted to learn Czech. And then I purposely decided to live in a village, at least for the first 2.5 years before I moved to Prague, so I could learn Czech. So nobody could speak English, and nobody would speak Russian. So I had to speak Czech. Other questions? Yes.
So, having read a lot of books in translation, it's from several of the authors I read, they stay with the same translator many times, right? They retain the same translator. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of, you've been selected for other additional translations?
Yes.
What is it about that relationship? I mean, obviously you're looking at authors who are not contemporary, but still the relationship between translator and author, or is that something you're going to get into on Wednesday?
Yeah, I'm going to talk a lot about translation. I think that translation is also a form of research. You have to know not only the language, but you also have to know its connotations, how it was used at that time, like in the 60s when Milton Underground was written, what these things really meant, and not just kind of blindly translate. I think it's important to use the same translator so that if in a different book an author uses the same terms, you're consistent throughout. That would be one reason. I think there's a big difference if there's a living translator, a living author, then you can actually work with the author, especially if the author knows at least some of your language. I worked with a Czech poet, and together, like, we translated his poetry. I translated it into English, and he knows English pretty well, actually. Not well enough to translate his poetry, but I translated it, sent it back to him, and then he says I would prefer it this way, and then we revise it together, and we develop a relationship. And I know a lot of translators have that kind of relationship with a contemporary author, like Havel had a translator like that, well, I don't know a lot of people, but Kumbera had a translator like that as well. So it really worked with him closely because you want to express his ideas in the same way in his different works. And as for like if it's an author who's no longer alive, Dostoevsky has his own translators too. He has he's been, all his works have been translated by a couple of translators, and again it's for the same reason that they want to keep the ideas, they want to express the ideas in the same way and not get you confused, I think. Especially like Dostoevsky is known as a very philosophical and ideological writer, and so you want to get the ideas right also. But then you could have a writer who's known for his language, like actually that Karasek that I had is known for his language, and you want to get his language right too. So you want to use the same words. If you're translating some word as exhausted all the time, then you don't want to translate it as tired another time. Well, you might want to, but it depends on, you have to think about how you want to do it. And another big problem with translation of a work that was written earlier, even in the 19th century. But think about it, if it was like Dante or something, or Boccaccio. Do you want to use the language of that time, or do you want to update the language so that students today will be able to read it more easily and relate to it? And we have to decide what your audience is. If you're translating Dante, who's from the 14th century, and you're translating for specialists, you might want to keep it like an older kind of English. But if you're translating for undergraduates, you want to make it more accessible. So because we want to translate for undergraduates, we want to keep a balance. So there were sometimes when I would actually use a word that, by the way, the publisher helps me. They have editors too. A lot of people help me. They have editors, native speakers, everything. I might use a word that's too colloquial, and they say, no, it doesn't sound right, doesn't sound like it would be used in the 19th century, or else it sounds too 19th century, and then they say, no, we don't think that the students would really, feel that word. Doesn't seem right for them. Other questions? Great, and then we go on to the translation next time?
Yep.
Okay.
So we'll see Dr. Lodge again on Wednesday. If you did not get the handout I gave, it's up here. If you want to grab it from me, it's on reflective writing number 2. If you want to grab it. We'll see you on Wednesday.
And then I'll bring copies of that handout for you for the next 2 meetings.
Oh, yeah,
Is that okay? Anything else?
great, that'd be great, yeah, because I never go up there.
Yeah, well, be happy to take care of it. How's the bunny doing?
The new bunny,
Yeah, you
he's
feel sick?
doing better, well, he just happened to come along with, something extra that, wasn't very nice.
Wow, okay.
But he has to go through his treatment and then he has to get checked. And he has to stay away from the other bunnies.
No, okay. Cool. Well, we'll see you tomorrow and have those handouts.
Yeah, tomorrow, yeah. Oh, yeah, tomorrow we'll have to do everything. I'm serious.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, from facilities visit or? I don't remember. I'll send it out. And I think I have all your. Sure, so I'll do that before Friday.
What?
I'll start in one day Friday.
Was there anything you wanted
Yeah,
me
I'll
to say
separate.
more of? or-
No,
So you're just trying to help with the newspaper.
Yeah, that's what I looked like. I looked everywhere.
Oh,
Right when you sent me that message, I looked in my junk.
About
It was in my junk, so I was like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So I just like replied to her like, probably when I have a chance.
So I'll resend you my essay as soon as I have access to Word tonight.
Okay, sure, thanks, yeah. Yeah, because it's just the Duff Pages format, I just can't read. So if you save it as a PDF, it should be fine.
I just got my Mac laptop, so I gotta download Microsoft Office.
Okay. All right, thank you.
No problem.
I put DOS